Hello and welcome. You're watching the Daily Report for Tuesday, February 22nd here in Korea. Long COVID continues to baffle health experts as research remains restricted with more medical attention on efforts to fight and treat actual infection. We have more later on the program. Here first is a global pandemic update with our Kwon So-ah. So let's start with the latest here on the local front then.
Sunny COVID-19 infections remained in the 90,000s for the second straight day, or actually close to 100,000 as you can see here. And that includes 99,444 domestic transmissions with 129 cases from abroad. And South Korea's COVID-19 death toll has surpassed 7,500 with 58 people having lost their lives in the past day. And going over to our graph, so for the second straight day, we were in the 90,000s, and also the number has roughly doubled from the week before. And on average, in the past 7 days, the daily average of infections has now stands now at above 99,000. And close to 30,000 infections were posted in Gyeonggi-do province as we go over to our map here, and also close to 22,000 in the capital Seoul, more than 7,700 in Incheon, also over 6,000 in the city of Busan. And in Jeollanam-do province, meanwhile, with a rise by around 2,100 new cases, this part has now surpassed 40,000 infections in total in the past day. And let's take a look at the number of patients that are in severe or critical condition, unchanged from the day before, but in the 400s now for the fourth straight day. Onto our vaccination figures, we've got a little less than 8,000 people who got their first shot on Monday, and a little over 5,400 who got their second one. And meanwhile, on the booster shot front, we've got now close to 60% of the nation's population who received an additional dose. Let's move over to our global figures. Little less than 1.4 million new cases were reported in the past day as of noon Korea time, and 3,000 additional fatalities. So there seems to be a slight drop in deaths compared to the day before. Now, countries that are still reporting more than 100,000 infections are countries like Russia and Germany. In fact, Russia in the past day has reported more than 152,000 new cases. And there are now exactly 40 countries in the world that have more than 2 million infections, and Korea is the nation with the 40th highest amount of cases. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for the global tallies of the past 24 hours. Up next, we bring you more coverage of the local Omicron situation. And for that, I have Choi Min-jung here in the studio. Min-jung, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Sunny.
Right, so authorities are bracing, Min-jung, for a further jump in our daily tally, I hear.
Right, Sunny. The country has been seeing record high daily tallies over the past few days. And for 5 weeks now, Korea's COVID-19 alert level has remained at high. Authorities revealed that 98.9% of infections confirmed last week were the Omicron strain. And in Jeju Island, the variant accounted for 100% of the new patients last week. Health authorities released a forecast on Monday based on studies conducted by 10 domestic and foreign institutes that the Omicron wave will hit its peak in late February or early March. And they expect daily cases to reach anywhere between 140,000 to 270,000 at the high water mark.
Right, and Min-jung, regardless of those alarming numbers, I hear authorities are urging against public panic.
Yes, they are cautiously optimistic that the current situation may be the start of a transition to an endemic phase of the pandemic. We've been seeing around 100,000 daily cases in the past couple of days, but the government says that there's no need to be overly concerned. Authorities revealed on Monday that the fatality rate of Omicron is around 0.13%, which is a manageable figure. Although it's twice as lethal as the seasonal flu, it's also a much lower figure than 0.7% death rate for the Delta variant. However, authorities also stressed that Omicron's fatality rate could be even lower than the seasonal flu among those who've gotten their booster shots. And data also shows that no one under the age of 50 in Korea has died so far from an Omicron infection. As of now, many experts are saying COVID-19 will likely become endemic, but they're still very hesitant to project a timeline on when exactly this will happen. KDCA Chief Jung Eun-kyung hinted that this outcome is possible if enough immunity is formed in the population and our healthcare system remains stable without the introduction of a new deadly variant.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, on the vaccination front, Minjung, what's the latest with regard to Novavax here in the country?
Well, Sunny, the number of people getting their first shots rose by nearly 20,000 on week after Novavax's vaccine started rolling out on February 14th. More than 43,000 people got their first shots last week, which is up around 19,000 from the week before. And around 63% of them received the Novavax vaccine. The vaccine is being met with less worries over possible side effect as it was developed using a more conventional method without the use of genetic materials. Meanwhile, there was also encouraging news regarding the effectiveness of Pfizer's oral drug. In a survey conducted on around 300 Paxlovid recipients here in Korea, 81% of the respondents said the drug was effective in treating respiratory symptoms and sore throats. And the majority also said that their conditions improved within 3 days of starting the drug treatment. And data also show that none of the people who took the complete 5-day course of the drug became severely ill or died.
Right, well, that is encouraging to know. And ahead of the new academic year slated for March, Minjung, I understand virtual learning is back on the table.
Right. Education authorities said Monday that schools can freely implement online classes or adjust school hours during the first 2 weeks of the spring semester. This means if the virus situation worsens, all classes can make a switch to full remote learning. Initially, the Education Ministry decided to hold in-person classes in the upcoming semester despite the current surge, and schools were advised to switch to online classes if 3% of all students at a school were infected or 15% of all students in a single grade were absent due to infection or self-isolation. But now this new guideline has been scrapped for the first 2 weeks due to increasing number of students coming down with the virus.
All right, Minjung, thank you for now, but do stay behind for more talks. Right, now for the latest government remarks with regard to our COVID-19 situation, Soa, you are back at the desk. I understand authorities have identified 2 specific groups that need to take extra care amid Omicron.
Right, Sunny, while assuring that the daily number of increasing COVID-19 cases itself is no longer something that the public has to panic about, officials at Tuesday's briefing emphasized the importance of protecting 2 groups, the unvaccinated and elderly, and in particularly the unvaccinated elderly. And as they are the ones with the highest chance of developing serious symptoms, despite the Omicron variant not deemed as dangerous as other strains. Currently, 6% of the population that's eligible to get inoculated is unvaccinated, which is 4% of the adult population. However, in the past 8 weeks, this group accounted for around 62% of serious or critically ill patients and more than 65% of COVID-19 incurred deaths. While there has been a rise in more serious cases recently, though, medical capacity remains stable, with some 36% of ICU beds in use nationwide and patients being designated to hospitals within a day with no one having to wait. As around 95% of infected people are currently being treated at home, the number of home recovery patients is approaching 500,000. 738 medical facilities are in operation for people who need intensive care and monitoring, with the number close to 70,000. The government says up to 210,000 can be managed.
Right, now so Minjung touched upon this lightly earlier on. I hear there's been a tangible rise in the number of infections among our young.
Right, Sunny. The confirmed number of coronavirus cases among children or teenagers under 19 more than doubled last week compared to the week before, standing at around close to 154,000 cases. And even considering that the Omicron variant has led to a doubling effect in general, in overall cases went up 1.7 times, showing that infections among kids appear to be rising faster. Children aged 18 and below made up 27.3% of total cases. Health Ministry official Son Young-ne in particular noted a high infection rate among kids aged below 11 recently. He furthermore expressed concerns over transmissions within households, in particular the risks posed by infections from these young kids to elderly family members.
Meanwhile, so I understand authorities also fielded questions on our planned exit strategy from the pandemic.
Well, Sunny, that strategy had been implemented back in November, with officials noting that this is when we are not hit by the Omicron wave yet, but had recovered to some extent from the Delta variant in terms of number of infections, the number of critically ill, as well as deaths. So this is what an official had to say regarding this issue.
Our planned exit strategy will be different than the one we had with the Delta variant in mind, and it'll need to be reorganized to fit the unique characteristics of Omicron when it comes to assessing risk and determining the pace of a return to normal.
So as of now, he added that factors to be considered will be to which extent the Omicron variant will peak and also whether our medical system will be burdened by this or not before we can return to a so-called living with COVID-19 scheme again.
So we'll have to wait for a while then.
Yes, we will.
Right, and moving on to the latest on the international front, Minjang, I understand England is poised to take a bold step toward a new normal starting later this week.
That's right, Sunny. England is set to lift all of its remaining COVID-19 restrictions as it embraces life with COVID-19. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Monday announced an end to remaining COVID-19 related legal requirements. So starting this Thursday, people will no longer have to self-isolate if they are infected, but will be advised to stay at home instead. And from April 1st, free COVID-19 tests will also be halted, except for those considered high risk. Johnson said the pandemic is not over, but acknowledged that the peak of the Omicron wave has passed. However, medical experts have urged authorities to take a more cautious approach, saying the move is premature even with cases dropping. The easing will only be applied to England, with other parts of the UK following their own health guidelines.
Right, I see. And staying overseas, so I understand on the vaccination front, some researchers are saying one booster dose will offer a person a long-term protection.
Well, the New York Times published a comprehensive article citing a number of studies that suggest one COVID-19 booster shot may provide protection for many months, which is nothing new, but even for many years, including against future variants. One expert said that third Pfizer or Moderna doses helped produce antibodies that help people to fight yet unseen variants with extra ammunition to fight them. And these findings refer to studies that go way back when Asia was hit by the SARS epidemic, because that found that people who caught the virus back then were producing specialized immune cells 17 years later. And such studies may be considered in the U.S. authorities that are currently mulling over whether they are going to approve an fourth mRNA shot or not. Now, meanwhile, in Italy, second booster shots or fourth shots may become available for the entire public in autumn, as authorities are looking to review this around summer. Now, that would be another step from what we talked about on Monday regarding the recommendation of the fourth jab for immunocompromised people. So now it's looking to make those available for the entire public. Now, also on the vaccination front, Japan is expected to start vaccinating children aged 5 to 11 starting as early as this week. They can receive 2 Pfizer doses with a 3-week interval, and the amount will be 1/3 of that a 12-year-old would get.
Right, I see. All right, so thank you very much for that coverage. Minjang, thank you as well, and see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
We start our news segment on this Tuesday with heightened tensions in Eastern Europe as Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for the deployment of troops into 2 territories in Ukraine, which he claims are independent of the latter. Omjung reports.
President Putin has ordered Russian troops to maintain peace in eastern Ukraine's 2 breakaway regions. This came after he signed a decree to officially recognize the rebel-controlled regions of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine as independent entities. He made the announcement during a live televised national address that lasted for almost 1 hour.
In this regard, I consider it necessary to make a long overdue decision to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. I asked the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation to support this decision and then to ratify the Treaty of Friendship and Mutual Assistance with both republics. These two documents will be readied and signed as soon as possible.
His decision paves the way for Moscow to openly send both military and weapons to defend Russia-backed rebels against Ukrainian forces and possibly extend to a larger war or invasion of the country. Shortly after, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation, saying Ukraine's international borders are to remain as such despite Russia's declarations and threats. In response to the decree, President Joe Biden signed an executive order placing sanctions on the separatist regions. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said earlier that such an order prohibits new investment, trade, and financing by U.S. persons to, from, or in the separatist regions of Ukraine. She also made it clear that measures are separate from and in addition to the swift and severe economic measures that they have been preparing in coordination with allies and partners should Russia further invade Ukraine. Europe has continuously warned of sanctions from the 27-nation bloc should Russia recognize the separatist regions as independent, as they could break a peace agreement in the region. 엄지영, Arirang News.
On the local front, there has been bipartisan accord for an extra budget bill to ease the financial woes of small business owners amid the prolonged pandemic. Our Lee Kyung-eun has more.
South Korea's National Assembly on Monday passed an extra budget bill worth some $14.2 billion aimed at compensating small business owners hit by COVID-19 restrictions. This comes as the ruling Democratic Party and the main opposition People Power Party reached a last-minute agreement to increase the budget by roughly $2.4 billion from what the government had initially proposed. With that, some 3.3 million businesses will get 3 million won each, about $2,500. The money will start being rolled out on Wednesday. A list of new recipients are added too. Tutors, golf caddies, and performing artists, as well as other freelance workers in the so-called special employment sector, will each get up to 1 million won or roughly $800 in emergency employment assistance. Private taxi drivers and bus drivers will get 1.5 million won or roughly $1,300 each. The money will be rolled out to recipients starting next month. Lastly, business owners who've seen a drop in sales could get compensation for up to 90% of the losses instead of the previous 80% proposed by the government. And the minimum amount they could get has been raised from 100,000 to 500,000 won or $420. However, the retroactive compensation, the money covering losses that occurred since the start of the pandemic, will not be covered by the new law. That, according to the DP and PPP, will likely be passed next month following more discussions. The tourism and performance sectors are likely to be covered. The passage comes just a little over 2 weeks until the country's presidential election, with the bill expected to affect the decisions of nearly 5 million small business owners. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
In the political arena, the 4 leading contenders in the presidential race partook in their third televised debate Monday night. On the table were economic policies to navigate the country through the pandemic and beyond. Kim Yo-san has details.
During Monday evening's televised debate, South Korea's 4 major presidential candidates clashed over economic policies in the pandemic era. The government's COVID-19 relief plan was the first topic during the third TV debate among the 4 candidates and the first hosted by the National Election Commission. Ruling party presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung and his main opposition party rival Yoon Suk-yeol agreed that swift compensation is needed for those hit hardest by the pandemic.
The nation should be responsible for what it tossed at the people. I vow full compensation for the losses suffered by micro-business owners, the self-employed and delivery workers.
Because the losses have been inflicted upon the self-employed and micro-business owners by state policies, they need to be swiftly compensated in accordance with the Constitution.
And Su of the minor opposition People's Party highlighted the need to ensure fiscal soundness.
Firstly, we need to move away from populist policies like a disaster relief for all and focus on those who have suffered damages.
Shim Sang-jung of the minor Progressive Justice Party called for new social rules while criticizing the two major parties for blaming each other.
Just as President Roosevelt overcame the Great Depression, overcoming a disaster requires new social rules.
Lee and Yoon frequently traded verbal barbs during the debate, wrangling over corruption allegations involving their former aides and family members. On the direction of the next government's economic policies, Lee said he will focus on tackling unfairness to drive growth, which was criticized by his opponents for its lack of practicality. Yoon stressed the need to foster a digital database economy, prompting criticism from An, who questioned its validity. Shim vowed to tackle inequality and make a transition to a green economy, while An called for lifting regulations on science and technology and called for more investment in the area. The candidates will take part in two more debates hosted by South Korea's election watchdog, scheduled for Friday and March 2nd, with a focus on politics and social issues respectively. The election takes place on March 9th. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
In other news, a shortage in labour is looking to disrupt the government's plans to keep the flow of self-test kits on track. Eun-jin explains.
Production lines for COVID-19 self-diagnosis test kits are working non-stop. The same goes for the workers that put together the kits with no time to rest. Government guidelines for supply control requires that these kits be packaged in smaller units, requiring even more manual labor. Some 700 employees are working 12-hour alternating shifts to keep this factory running round the clock.
We've been working full-time since the Lunar New Year holidays, not even taking a single day off. We're tired, but our country is in a state of emergency.
Even at this rate, only 2 million test kits can be produced in a single day, nowhere close to meeting the demand. But the real problem is that there's also a labor shortage. At full capacity, machines can facilitate production of more test kits, up to 4 or 5 million a day. But some machines have been left idle with no one to run the additional production lines. There's been a call for special measures to be introduced, like deploying the military, as was done for the mask supply crisis last year, which was met with some criticism.
Public opinion was rather negative during mask shortages. There were lots of complaints from parents, so I think that's why the government is very reluctant to take such action.
Ahead of the new school semester next month, the government plans to supply roughly 200 million self-test kits, but the supply crisis is expected to continue for the time being. Eun-jin, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. According to the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman on Monday, significant progress has been made in Vienna during talks to revive the 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and world powers. However, Iran's top security official noted that Iran and their European negotiators would continue talks without the United States, as they would not be the source of any breakthrough. Meanwhile, despite significant progress being made, Iran also noted that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, adding that the remaining issues are the hardest. Last week, Reuters reported that a U.S.-Iran deal was taking shape in Vienna after months of indirect talks to revive the nuclear pact. The draft text of the agreement alluded to issues such as unfreezing billions of dollars of Iranian funds in South Korean banks and the release of Western prisoners held in Iran. Iran's foreign ministry said Saturday that it would be ready to swap prisoners with the U.S., adding that talks to revive the nuclear deal could succeed at the earliest possible time if Washington made the necessary political decision. Italy's Mount Etna is active once again as a massive plume of ash rose into the sky over Sicily on Monday. The massive plume rose some 10 kilometers from the southeast crater of Europe's tallest and most active volcano, while spewing ash and large clouds of smoke into the sky over surrounding villages. The latest volcanic activity caused nearby Catania airport to be shut. The over 3,300-meter-high volcano showcases its power several times a year, spewing lava and ash high over the Mediterranean island, but rarely causes damage. Experts say the eruptions themselves do not put the local population at risk. One of the iconic stone monuments from the Easter Island, known as the Moai statue, began its journey back home on Monday, following a years-long campaign to get it returned to its original setting on the island after being showcased in a museum in Santiago since the 19th century. The 715-kilogram sculpture will be transported by truck to the Chilean port city, Valparaiso, from where it will then be placed on a naval ship for 5 days to reach the remote Easter Island, known locally as Rapa Nui. The move is part of a repatriation program seeking to return ancestral remains and sacred and funerary objects to the Pacific Ocean island. Similar negotiations have taken place to recover other artifacts in the hands of British museums. Easter Island, which is located some 3,200 kilometers from the coast of Chile, has over 1,000 stone statues that were carved centuries ago by the island's inhabitants, bringing it fame and UNESCO World Heritage Site status. With the 2022 Beijing Winter Games coming to a close, the Olympic flag landed at Milan's Malpensa Airport on Monday, with Italy now set to host the Games for the second time, 20 years after Torino 2006. The Olympic flags were waved by the mayors of Milan and Cortina, the two host cities of the 2026 Winter Games, followed by Italian athletes, including Arianna Fontana. The Milan-Cortina Games will be a two-center games, with ice sports taking place in Milan and alpine activities in the mountains of Cortina. With COVID-19 impacting both the 2020 Tokyo Summer Games and the 2022 Beijing Winter Games, organizers and fans alike hope the 2026 Milan-Cortina Winter Games will be the first Winter Games hosted COVID-free. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Italy is taking cautious steps into a new normal as the daily tally there has declined to the 5 digits from 6 last month. For more on the COVID-19 situation there, I have Dr. Michele Usuelli, who is also the Regional Council of Lombardy, live on the line. It's been a while, Dr. Usuelli, and it's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Thank you for having me.
Right, earlier this month, Dr. Usuelli, Italy lifted its outdoor mask mandate while keeping in place mask requirements for indoor settings. Do tell us a bit about the background behind this move.
Yes, we are mask-free outside unless it is not crowded. And the decision has been taken by our national government because of the epidemiological and scientific data allows it. The percentage of people in Italy who completed their vaccination schedule are nearly 83%. 49 million people, and people who just received one dose, but this is a good news because they are just recently convinced, are another 1.5 million people, 2.5% of the population. Only 5% of over 50, those who are at greater risk, never received the dose of vaccine. Children aged 5 to 11 received one dose in nearly 40% of the total population. And the risk of admission, now it is very clear in Italy, in intensive care or the risk of dying is more than 20 times higher in the no-vax population. We had our Omicron peak middle January. And from now on, for the third consecutive weeks, we are experiencing an important deflection of the new cases, 30% less every week. We assist to a constant reduction in intensive care as well as non-intensive care bed occupancy rate. And the daily average fatality rate in 1 week dropped from 350 to 300 in the last 15 days. So the situation looks better.
Right, that is good to know. Dr. Usuelli, now despite efforts to ease social restrictions, I understand Italy is maintaining its tough stance against those who are unvaccinated. Having said that, how is this particular stance being regarded by the public there?
That is correct. Novax in Italy is a small, noisy community, but smaller and smaller. The two main right populist parties, Lega and Fratelli d'Italia, have been a lot indulgent with Novax community in the past. Now they do it more silently. Vaccination is not compulsory in Italy, but there are an increasing number of places where Novax people cannot enter anymore. In addition, and this is very strong message by our government, now unvaccinated people, more than 50 years old workers, they are put on unpaid leave. On the other hand, government has now put in place new rules at school level. Let's say, generally speaking, that if a student is vaccinated, when she or he is a contact of a positive case, he can continue to go to school. But if not vaccinated, the student must stay quarantined at home.
Right, I see. And staying with those vaccinated, Dr. Usueli, what can you tell us about the Green Pass system over in Italy?
Yes. I support the Green Pass party, who doesn't exist, by the way. We could invent it. The Green Pass has been progressively implemented. In the beginning, you could get the Green Pass if immunized or healed since less than 5 months. Or with a negative test, you could get a 72 hours Green Pass. Then, learning from scientific data, we reduced the limit for the Green Pass to 4 months, not 5 anymore. But recently, government has decided that you cannot have a Green Pass just with a negative test. So there are scanners and mobile apps in our pubs, restaurants, museums, and public places. And just with a negative test, you cannot enter anymore.
Right, I see. Dr. Usueli, authorities in Italy have recommended a second booster shot, I understand. Initially, it was recommended for those who are immunocompromised, but according to our colleagues who are earlier on, the recommendation may also be extended to those adults, healthy adults, starting this autumn. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I also have seen, as you reported before, the article from the New York Times. But let me say that at present, the booster, we can call in Italy the fourth dose, the European Medicine Agency recommended just for those with deficit of the immune system. And considering that in Italy, many of them received the third dose more than 4 months ago, it's urgent now that the Italian Agency of Drugs and the Ministry of Health speak quickly about the fact that the third dose should be given to the people with immunodeficit. In the end, the decline of the fourth wave of COVID we have due to high vaccine coverage rate and spring is coming allow us to see the future with reasonable optimism. If new variants that are more severe or more contagious will not arrive. Knowing this, we have learned that it has its own seasonality, the virus. It's time now, we have few free months to plan for autumn, to study better for the autumn, and politicians have to learn how to foresee the planning. I am a bit worried because in next March 2023, there will be, as you are experiencing now, political elections. So we need to plan for this winter. But if it becomes too partisan, the game, then it can be dangerous if political parties dispute it.
Well, planning has to be a task for every country, I suppose. All right, Dr. Usueli, as always, thank you very much for making the time to join us live at this very early hour at your end with your thoughts.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
Most COVID-19 patients fully recover from their infection, but a few endure unexplained health conditions for weeks or even months later. For more on this phenomenon, I have Professor David Kwok from Sooncheng University. Professor Kwok, it's good to see you again.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
I also have Dr. Alice Hyungyang Tan at Ms. Medi Women's Hospital live on the line. Dr. Tan, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
Professor Kwok, the World Health Organization has made public its first official definition of the term long COVID. This was made back in October last year. Let's begin with this definition and perhaps a few words on the importance of having a standardized definition of long COVID.
Right. Well, let me begin with the importance of the standardized definition, because in order for any medical sector to treat a patient or a person showing certain symptoms, the symptoms need to be clearly defined for the medical doctors or nurses to decide to go ahead with the treatment. If those are not clearly defined, it'll be very vague and it'll be very hard for the medical sector to actually start taking actions or decide when to start taking the actions on certain group of symptoms. So the WHO made a definition that long COVID stands for those people who've had acute phase of COVID-19, possibly having the symptom last for about the next couple of months, but people who are continuing to show those symptoms even from third month and on, meaning 12 weeks, are now going to be considered people of long COVID. Those certain symptoms include anything from shortness of breath, fatigue, cognitive dysfunction. So these are all very usual symptoms that a person can show while having the acute phase of COVID-19. But if they continue to have those symptoms remain even afterwards, let's say 12 weeks afterwards, then they're going to be considered as a person having long COVID. But currently, several studies are showing that these symptoms are not only limited to only a certain period after the 12 weeks, but they can actually be found to have it up to about a year of span, but possibly more, because we are also limited to the time of frame that we've studied these populations so far.
Right. And Dr. Tan, you've previously spoken about the need to focus on long COVID. Would you like to start by reiterating your thoughts?
Yes. So, even though statistically, right now we're in the midst of the Omicron wave, even though statistically Omicron may cause less severe disease or severe disease in fewer people, there's no guarantee that Omicron COVID will cause fewer cases of long COVID ultimately. And so I'm very concerned. Long haul COVID could potentially affect hundreds of thousands of people. And as Dr. Kwok just said, we don't know when long COVID may end. It might be indefinite in some people. It may be years that they have to suffer from these symptoms. And so many doctors are calling long haul COVID the next public health crisis. And I think it's great that we're spending time to have attention on this issue. Definitely this is a health crisis that needs to be addressed and researched and talked about, so that people who have these symptoms can actually come out and talk to their doctors about them and not just wonder and suffer why they're feeling these symptoms on their own at home. That's not the situation that we want for our long-haul COVID patients.
Right, a very valid point, of course. Now, Professor Kwok, as you mentioned, some of the better-known symptoms of long COVID are brain fog and fatigue. What are some of the recently disclosed symptoms of this condition, and what are the implications of such findings?
Right, so people have been mainly speculating that there would be some other typical symptoms that from COVID-19 that we were bound to see sometimes afterwards, because mainly even with the acute phase of COVID-19, people are having issues with thromboembolism, meaning they're causing myocardial infarction. They could have caused cerebrovascular diseases and whatnot. And recently, a journal published in a very renowned journal called Nature has found that there were people having cerebral and cardiovascular problems in the long run of the COVID-19 after the acute phase. So they were having much greater chances of, let's say, people having cardiac issues such as heart failure, myocardial infarction, but also there were people who were having, let's say, brain strokes, much more commonly for those who've had COVID-19 before compared against those people who've not had COVID-19 before. They actually found those to be in the numbers of 50 to about 70% higher rates in those who've had COVID-19. So it clearly shows that COVID-19 impacts us in the long run, not just from the short acute phase. But it also found that people with different vaccination records, histories, and also people who's had it more severely against those who's had it mildly, incrementally show different severity of the symptoms, meaning people who've had it much severely with COVID-19 tended also to have much higher rate of these incidences that I just mentioned. They actually found for those people who were contained in ICU beds because of COVID-19 to possibly have 3 times as much of the possibility to have, let's say, heart-related diseases or brain-related diseases, and so on. So I think this study and many other different studies are also accumulating that clearly shows COVID-19 is not just a short-phase disease, but it can possibly impact us in the long run as well.
Right. Dr. Dan, keeping in mind what Professor Kwok has just said, so long COVID, the risks of long COVID, that is, appears to depend on the severity of your COVID-19 infection. Does it also perhaps depend on your age, would you say?
Yes, it can. But in terms of the severity and the proportion, so even though people who've had severe COVID, who are hospitalized due to COVID, they have a higher chance of having long-haul COVID symptoms. It was actually found that a similar proportion of people who had mild symptoms also complained of long-haul COVID symptoms 1 to 3 months after their acute illness. In terms of age, it was a myth that was believed that children did not have long-haul COVID after their acute infection. But a study from Italy showed that up to 51% of children complained of long-haul COVID symptoms, primarily tiredness, loss of smell or taste, and headache, 1 to 3 months after their acute illness. More than half of the children had these symptoms. And so certainly severity can play a role, but in terms of age, no one seems to be immune. In another study out of Harvard School of Public Health, it was found that up to 1/3 of people in the older population also had long-haul COVID symptoms, including dementia, post-viral fatigue, and respiratory failure. So this is a condition that can affect anyone who's had COVID, of any age, of any severity.
Right, so it's quite unpredictable then. Professor Kwok, some believe though that the symptoms of long COVID after an Omicron infection may differ from those following a Delta infection. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I would dearly hope so, because as Dr. Tan already mentioned, the COVID-19 long-haul symptoms were primarily unrelated to ages that or even severity for that matter, in regards to the frequency of mild long-haul COVID-19 symptoms. But I'm hoping, just because Omicron is less likely to cause a severe COVID-19, if we can deduce a certain theory out of the study that was published in Nature, that people who were contained in, let's say, ICU beds or admitted to hospital were much more likely, let's say double the times or three times more likely than who did not have COVID-19 to have, let's say, the severe types of long-haul COVID-19 symptoms, such as myocardial infarction or heart failures. I'm hoping that because Omicron tends to comparatively less than before cause severe forms of COVID-19, hoping that also it'll tend to cause less frequency of these long-haul COVID-19 symptoms as well.
Right, but we are not certain.
We're not certain. There are no study that clearly proves any of these findings yet.
Right, and talking about findings, quite a bit of our current findings, Dr. Dan, are based on long COVID, that is, are based on adults and not children. Having said that, I suppose related research on children has been rendered quite challenging, right?
Yes, I would agree. And as I said before, there was a myth that children did not suffer from long-haul COVID. And so because of this myth, there was decreased interest, and because there's decreased interest, there's less research and less funding into this issue. There are also logistical concerns. Children sometimes have a harder time expressing their symptoms, and sometimes research has to be done with parents. Parents need to be sort of the intermediary for the children in research projects. And sometimes parents are reluctant to talk about what's going on in their children, especially when it pertains to COVID. And so there are multiple issues, I think, that are at play, but more and more research is showing that the legacy of COVID in children could be long-term, both health effects and also economic effects that could be lifelong. And so this is definitely an issue that needs to be looked at more carefully.
Right. And Professor Kwok, the causes of long COVID have yet to be fully understood. Having said that, what are your personal thoughts?
Well, so I'm still going back to the reference, the Nature publication, or that I keep referring. That they actually listed a different possible causes or correlated issues that might have caused these long-term COVID-19 symptoms as opposed to just the acute phase of it. And they mentioned anything from, let's say, direct viral toxicity to possible dysfunction in immune reaction to a prior infection. I think, and this is just my pure personal view, that COVID-19 tends to be a two-phased, primarily vascular disease. That's why it causes so much trouble, anything that's connected through vessels. But also at the same time, it causes a lung issue that's more so stemming from immune reaction to the prior infection. That's why if people are not treated with certain regimen of treatment, once a certain time passes, it no longer can be controlled. That's why all these medical regimen that we have in hand so far does not work in those people who already are having severe forms of COVID-19. So I think further studies obviously have to be done to find out exact causes for possible long-haul COVID-19 symptoms. But I think the main focus of it would probably stay in those in the vasculature and also immune reactions and immunity.
Right, and staying with the same question, Dr. Dan, what do you believe is causing this health condition after COVID-19 infection?
Yes, I would agree that probably the immune system, dysregulated immune response, possibly also autoimmune responses are responsible, but also, of course, there are direct pathological effects from acute COVID on organs, on the vasculature, and certainly on autopsy studies, we have seen the effects of acute COVID. And we could imagine that the damage done to organs, to blood vessels, would take a long time, weeks to months, to completely heal.
Dr. Dan, how then are long COVID patients treated in the absence of a clear cause behind their condition?
Yes, it's very difficult to manage long-haul COVID patients, but the most important principle is that it must be patient-centered and also multidisciplinary. So a patient should have a thorough evaluation. Specialty referrals should be made depending on what the patient is complaining of. For example, if they have respiratory symptoms, they should be sent to a pulmonologist. If they're having palpitations, they should be referred to a cardiologist. A rehabilitation specialist at the center of care, I think, is very important because a lot of the symptoms have to do with decreased ability to function, fatigue, sometimes exhaustion, post-exertional exhaustion. And so having a rehab specialist involved is very important. And also, there are some mental health concerns as well. Due to long-haul COVID, we know anxiety and depression are more common in long-haul COVID patients. And so having mental health services available is also an important component of the management of these patients.
Right, I see. Professor Kwak, research by UK experts reportedly saw that those who were vaccinated were less likely to suffer from long COVID. Could you tell us a bit more about this finding?
Sure, and I'm going to add on to the study done by the UK, another study that actually found also a very similar finding, also out of Israel, that they had clear evidence that people who were vaccinated compared with those not vaccinated showed much less frequency of continuing to have symptoms after acute phase of COVID-19. And I think that it's mainly due to the severity that they went through the disease because, as we all know by now, vaccines do at least, if not just stopping the transmission, they at least reduce greatly the severity of COVID-19. For those people who are vaccinated are much less likely to be admitted to ICU beds, much less likely to have severe forms such as shortness of breath and whatnot. So there are, and out of that speculation, these studies have hard proofs that those vaccinated will also be much less likely to continue to have COVID-19 long time after. Further iterating why we need to vaccine those people who are vulnerable, but also the fact that why we need to allow children between 5 and 11 years of age to be allowed to receive vaccine in Korea as well.
Right, we have yet to give that green light then. Dr. Tan, what do you recommend to allow for a productive study into long COVID here on the local front as we look ahead to a possible post-pandemic future?
Well, I understand here in Korea, the National Infectious Diseases Research Center did start a study looking into long-haul COVID in Korea. They started last September. The results are still forthcoming, and so we should await those results. But what we need is really a multi-center research project in all parts of our country. Of course, it should be in terms of the time span, looking at not just the people who were infected early on, but throughout the course of the pandemic, and see if there are really differences due to the different variants that have passed through our country. But I think the most important thing to let our patients know is that when they have symptoms, they should not try to rationalize, they should not ignore them. They really need to come forth and let their doctors know what they're feeling. And doctors, we can't ignore what our patients are saying. It needs to be well documented, and hopefully we will have a post-acute COVID specialty treatment center, not just in Seoul, but in all the metropolitan regions around the country, so that the people who suffer from this illness can get the care that they need.
Right, so strengthening or bolstering efforts to treat these long COVID patients will be essential then. All right, Dr. Dan, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts. And Professor Kwak here in the studio, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Right, and on that note, we end this edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back with more coverage tomorrow. That is Wednesday. Join us then. Thank you for now.